Hey everybody, and welcome to a new video. Are you always looking for ways to get sharper images but can't seem to get the results you want? In this video, I'm going to show you the #1 easiest way to get more sharpness and better image quality out of your current gear, and that is finding your lens's sweet spot. If you stay through the end, I'll show you how to find your sweet spot on your very own lenses. My name is Simon D'Entremont, and I'm a professional nature and wildlife photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for nature and wildlife photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. So when I talk about a lens's sweet spot, what am I talking about? I'm referring to the aperture setting at which the lens is sharpest and has the least amount of optical aberrations. And if you shoot at that aperture setting, you'll get the sharpest image possible from your lens and the best image quality. Now, why do lenses have a sweet spot in the first place? There are two opposing forces at play here on either end of a spectrum, and they both have to do with how lenses work. Lens aperture is controlled by movable diaphragm blades that control the size of the opening of your lens, just like the iris in your eye opens and closes to control how much light enters your eye. The aperture blades are controlled by your camera f-number setting, which kind of feels backwards. A low f-number like f2.8 means a large opening, and a large f-number like f16 means a small opening. Wide open, lenses suffer from optical aberrations that improve as the lens aperture gets smaller. So the smaller you make the aperture, the better the optical performance. The problem is, at the other end of the spectrum, lenses get another type of optical aberration at very small apertures that get even worse as it gets even smaller, giving increasingly worse optical performance. So the trick in finding the sweet spot is discovering the aperture at which the aberrations from having a wide open aperture are well managed, but that the other optical aberrations from too small an aperture haven't yet kicked in. Let's look at these aberrations. Lens design is a complicated and difficult job. Gathering light and focusing it to a small point without all kinds of imperfections is hard and often leads to many optical aberrations. Vignetting is when the edges of the frame are darker from either physical blocking of the field of view on the sides of the image or optically from less effective light transmission. Coma is a feature where the light that's off-center will be stretched like stars in the corners of my Milky Way photos. And barrel distortion is when the frame gets stretched or warped, changing the proportions of an image. But at large open apertures, lenses suffer from two more types, called spherical aberration and chromatic aberration. Chromatic aberration is the result of light of many constituent colors failing to focus at the same point, caused by an effect called dispersion, the same effect that produces rainbows and makes light going through a prism break up into its constituent colors. That's because the various optical elements inside a lens are trying to bend and manipulate light in order to get it to focus at a certain point onto your camera's sensor. The problem is when you pass light through something like water or glass, the different colors, which are also in different wavelengths, bend at different rates. This means they don't focus at the same point. Another problem caused by this phenomenon is color fringing. The shorter wavelengths of purple and violet, like in the edge of a rainbow, can be left out of focus in an image. This smears the purple as it's out of focus, and if it's against a light-colored background like the sky, it shows up as purple fringing in the edges of dark features. The other type of aberration in lenses that comes into play at wide-open apertures is spherical aberration. When light hits a spherical surface like a lens element in the center, it can continue to pass largely unaltered. But when light beams strike a spherical surface off-center, it's bent at different rates depending on its offset. The problem with this is for a camera to get sharp images, the light from the whole image needs to come to a focus at a single point, the sensor plane. Spherical aberration means that the light bent from the edges of the lenses are bent more or less than the ones in the center, impacting its ability to focus all the rays at a certain point. Now, there are several ways to reduce these optical aberrations. One is to bend the light less sharply so that the aberrations are less. In the 17th century, telescopes were made with very long focal lengths of like 200 feet or 60 meters. Another is to use lens coatings, optical elements made from exotic materials like fluorite, and complicated lens designs to mitigate these effects. But these lenses, like my 600mm f4, can cost like $15,000. The good news is there's another way to control these optical aberrations, and it's free. Now you may have noticed that in both types of optical flaws I mentioned earlier, the farther from the center of the lens the light passes, the worse their effects are. So how do you fix this? You only use the center of the lens. And how do you do that? You stop the lens down. That is, you make the aperture smaller so that the outer parts of the lens, where the aberrations are worst, aren't used. The more you limit the light going to the sensor from the center of the lens, the better the image gets. Well, why don't we make the hole really small and get it almost perfect? Not so fast. By the way, follow me on social media where I almost always give a tip with every post. And if you sign up to my email list on my website, you can download my guide for shooting backlit for free. Link below. Now, when we get into increasingly smaller apertures, we run yet into another optical aberration. When waves in the ocean meet an obstruction like an island, the waves that go around it don't leave a perfectly still pool of water behind the island. The waves bend around the island a little bit. The same thing happens to light. When waves of light pass by an edge or through an opening, the interference causes a bending of the light around the edges. These waves interfere with other waves around it, creating interference and reducing the quality of the image on your sensor. When the opening is large, the impact is very small, but when the opening gets progressively smaller, the ratio of waves that are interfered with gets progressively larger. This is called diffraction. So the smaller you make your aperture, while it improves chromatic and spherical aberrations, makes diffraction worse. So finding the best aperture for image quality is finding the compromise aperture that's small enough to reduce spherical and chromatic aberration, but not so small as to introduce diffraction. This is called the lens's sweet spot. Taking photos at this aperture will lead to the best image quality available from your lens. So how do you determine the sweet spot for your lens? There are test results from third parties, there's the rule of thumb method, and there's the home test method. Now, a website called DxOMark tests actual lenses for various optical properties. Red on these graphs isn't very good, and green is better optical sharpness. This lens, for example, has a maximum aperture of f2.8, but isn't sharp at that aperture. Only when you get up to f4 does it get sharp, solidly into the green. Then at f8, it starts to lose sharpness again. So f5.6 seems to be in the middle there. So you can go there and see if your lens has ever been tested. Another method is the rule of thumb method. That method suggests that 2 stops from wide open is often the sharpest. And indeed, for the f2.8 lens we just looked at, f5.6 looks to be the sharpest, which is 2 stops. But this needs some context and tweaking. Smaller sensors like crop sensors and micro four thirds already use a smaller section of the lens, so they may not need as much stopping down to find the sweet spot, especially on a lens made for full frames. Also, shorter focal lengths like wide-angle lenses often benefit a bit more from stopping down, as there's more bending of light in those. They may need 3 stops. Long focal length lenses often need less and may be best with just 1 smaller stop of aperture. And finally, more premium lenses are often designed with better designs and more expensive elements that do better wide open. So inexpensive lenses may need more stopping down than premium ones. Which leads us to the third method, as every setup is different, so it's to test your very own lens. That's right, find out from your very own lens and camera what the sweet spot is. So let's set up a test that will be accurate and minimize any variables. Set up your camera and lens on a tripod or stable platform like a table or a countertop. Set your camera shutter to the 2-second timer or use a shutter release to reduce any vibration from pressing the shutter button. On a DSLR, you can put your camera into live view or raise the mirror with mirror lockup. For a mirrorless camera, you can even put your camera on the electronic shutter to reduce any shutter vibration. Put up a target that's flat and has fine detail, like a cereal box fine print against the fridge. Or currency notes actually make a good target. Make sure you're 90 degrees to it so all the parts are the same distance. We want good lighting and a low ISO, so put your camera on aperture priority, AV mode to control the aperture, and ISO 100. The camera will adjust the shutter speed to make the images the same brightness. If you have a zoom lens, the long and short focal length may have different results. Use the middle of the focal length zoom available if you often use the whole range, but test one end of the lens if that's what you always use, like maybe 400 millimeters on a 100 to 400 millimeter lens if that's what you always shoot at. Now focus on the target and turn the lens focus off if possible. You want to compare apples to apples, so always the same focal plane. Now take a series of images without moving the camera too much. First, wide open, like in my case at f4.5. Then in one-click increments, make the aperture smaller, f5, f5.6, 6.3, etc., all the way to your smallest aperture. On some lenses, this may be f16, f22, even f32. Mine is f29. Now bring your images to your computer in a program that allows you to zoom into the images, like here in Lightroom. Make one-to-one previews for the highest quality reference images. Here in the library module, I can use the compare view to compare two images at the same time. I can use wide open as my reference image and use the arrow keys to advance the images to see how they change at different apertures. Don't forget that the center of the images are usually better quality than the edges, so compare both across the images. You may notice more improvement in the corners than in the middle. Note that you may not have one aperture that stands out far and above the rest. Chances are that you'll see a gradual improvement as you make the aperture smaller, then a steady state as it doesn't change much, then it will get worse again at higher f numbers like f13 or f16 as diffraction kicks in. On my little Canon M50 with the kit lens 15 to 45 millimeters with a maximum aperture that varies from f3.5 to f6.3, if I shoot at 26 millimeters, the image improves as I stop down from wide open at f4.5, f5, 5.6, 6.3 still better, 7.1 better, f8, f9, f10, f11 just ever so slightly better, f13 no difference, nor f14. Above f16, I see the quality go down again and f29 isn't sharp at all. Here's my homemade results chart. Now how do we put these results to use in real life? Aperture changes don't come without trade-offs. Smaller apertures, if you don't have a tripod or your subjects aren't still, come with a trade-off of more noise or blurry images. So closing down your aperture isn't free per se. You may be trading off image quality or a thin depth of field which you may want to use creatively. So what do I do and what do I recommend? Do I think you should use the aperture setting at the very peak of this graph at absolute best sharpness? I actually don't. I recommend to stop down your aperture until you hit the start of the sweet spot. Why? Because at that aperture, you're getting 98% of the benefits of sharpness, but the cost of low light, noisy images, slower shutter speeds, and deeper depths of field aren't getting too bad yet. Any further, and those trade-offs start being more of a cost than the benefits you've gained. So on my M50 with the kit lens, f10 gives me most of what I need, and any further gives me too little benefit. So f10 it is. If this got you intrigued and you want to learn more about lenses, what all those numbers mean like primes and zooms and focal lengths, check out my video on that, which you can see right here. If this video is deserving, give it a like, and I hope that you can use this information the very next time you go out to get your own unique, amazing, and sharp photos. I know you can do it.